Narrative News bringing you Week in Review today on Sunday the 5th of February 2023. Wanted to just reflect upon this last week in relation to the growing tensions and confrontation, or one should say arguably the growing US tension vis-a-vis its relationship with Beijing. General Minahan in the USA very much representing the most war-oriented faction of the Republican Party community. General Minahan arguing that there will be a war with China over the issue of Taiwan in the next 2 years by 2025. You have Penny Wong, the foreign minister in Australia, trying to push back at the growing militaristic rhetoric between the West on the one hand, particularly the US and Britain, and against China on the other, and trying to use her Chinese heritage and Malaysian heritage to try and encourage more of a dialogue between these confronting parties. Then you have the quite farcical incident of the Chinese weather balloon, which the Chinese argue has floated accidentally into US territory, and then the most far right wing of the Republican Party and other interests of global US neocolonialism competing with the Democratic Party as to who can be the most confrontational and nationalistic against China, with former Secretary of State Pompeo arguing for a couple of days that the Biden administration should have shot it down, and the Biden administration eventually does shoot down the spy meteorological balloon. Also, Pompeo's comments in the last few days as to, he argues, yes, Putin is quote unquote evil, but he argues that China wants to take over the world. Now, he is actually quite accurate in some regards in representing leading elements of Western colonial capitalism or finance capitalists, basically the ruling and political class, which is very much interested in growing domination politically, culturally, economically, militarily across the world, and such is the rationale of the capitalist system itself that's been analysed by the most sharpest theorists of the capitalist system. That's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and then Vladimir Lenin, arguably, and then others as well. The system pursues the highest rate of profit, and that means domination and monopoly of power on all levels, everywhere. And as we go forward, as a system develops its own crises, the most vicious elements of those ruling class come to the fore in a project of far-right populism and nationalism, what other people will call perhaps the earlier stages of fascism itself, i.e. the growing suspension of any pretenses to democracy within this system, and as the crisis reveals the system as very much the dictatorship of a very few billionaires and trillionaires on the planet. Indeed, the richest few men on the planet have more wealth than the poorest half of the entire world population. Now, I think things are clear that the Chinese did not intend for this crisis over the balloon to have taken place, because it happened at the same time where Secretary of State Blinken was about to visit his counterparts in the Beijing leadership, and that trip got cancelled. And I think that's something that Beijing would wanted to have avoided at all costs, and very much so Beijing's comments, which were extremely apologetic and defensive as the crisis developed in the last 48 hours. Beijing this was an accident, basically profusely apologizing, and really in its diplomatic language requesting its US partners to climb down from the growing confrontational rhetoric. Of course, when the liberal capitalists and then the right-wing capitalists are in a constant competition as to who can be the most nationalistic in defending its own economic interests, and you have that played out between Pompeo and Biden and General Minahan and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, like as always with these patterns and dynamics, will be looking to prove itself even more, that it's the champion, it's the beholder it's the leader of defending the US national interest in this most kind of violent and confrontational way. So Biden shoots down the balloon. This has some echoes of the 2001 incident where there was a U.S. spy plane that was basically forced to land by the Chinese back in 2001, but that was a total different era ago. That was 2001, just as the Chinese leadership are starting to step away from its close alignment of the previous several decades with US foreign policy and starts to chart slightly its own independent route out of that. And very much the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in the NATO operation against Serbia in 1999 was a warning to China that it shouldn't do that. But China has its own political and ruling classes have their own nationalist interest in developing their nation in order to make their own profits and super profits, and they are a competitor, as is Russia, as a bloc on the world stage vis-a-vis the West, and the West will always treat this type of competition in a manner of no apology confrontation, and it will destroy whole nations in its capitalist competition globally. The West has arguably ensnared China in the Ukraine trap. Primarily, Putin and the Moscow leadership have successfully been ensnared in this historical quagmire by the leadership of the West in the Ukraine war. The West is not interested in the Ukrainians winning its resistance and right of self-determination and self-defense against the Russian aggression. It's very happy for Ukraine to be a long-term arena where it saps the energy and the resources of the Russian bloc as a global competitor. And in that also, it's ensnared China, because as the Ukraine conflict emerged because of the Russian foolish decision to enter it, the Chinese were somewhat dizzy with success in alignment with the Moscow leadership for the last decade or so. The Chinese leadership is split. On the one hand, it realizes its most important global relationship is with Washington, not with Moscow, but a section of the Chinese leadership in anxieties about its own defense for itself. A section of it, or perhaps even in the person of Xi Jinping, the leader of China, is in two minds, as on the one hand, to trying to defend his own nationalistic interest in the context of growing Western confrontation. He's thinking, should I tag along with Putin and Moscow? Is that going to work in defending myself? Or should I recognize the problems and entrapment for what that is and lean back from that and try to calm things with the West? But there is no calming with the West either, because the West is dead set, ever since Obama's quote-unquote pivot to Asia, to confront China very explicitly. The confrontation with China has been going on for a long time. In the 60s, the US leadership threatened China with nuclear attack, which led Mao to argue that imperialism and its allies are nothing but paper tigers, and it's the people's revolutionary energy and struggle that will win the day, which had echoes in what Che Guevara was arguing and other, that kind of really the most revolutionary period that we've had, which was the 1960s. Then by the late 1970s, the Chinese leadership, starting with its secret meeting first with Henry Kissinger and then with Nixon in 1971 and 72, decides in its own narrow nationalist interest to very closely align with the US in terms of foreign policy across the world. So supporting the US in places like Chile, Afghanistan, across certain places in Africa, including Angola, and other issues, and also then becoming the greatest reserves of the dollar. That's the Chinese holding the greatest dollar reserves in the world, and being a guarantor of US world domination in the financial sense. So by the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, I mean, very much so, China's main competitor state that it saw as such was the Soviet Union. That collapses by 1991. By the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, a new Chinese leadership tries to chart its own more assertive role in the world in accordance with its own economic interests as well. The Chinese ruling class are a billionaire ruling class. They are embedded in the same global capitalist system as Wall Street and the City of London. So it's quite difficult for the Chinese to now decide how to deal with the West, considering how deeply embedded it is with the West politically and economically. So that's why you're seeing a very confused and very inconsistent and an approach lacking nearly total confidence from the Chinese leadership. They just don't know what to do in this regards. And adding to the insecurities of the Chinese leadership is like a lot of the big kind of flagship projects that they had is just looking very mute now. The Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road Initiative is in a lot more problems because of the different conflicts and social eruptions that's happened across Asia with the working class uprising in Kazakhstan. The Beijing leadership supported Putin's army going in to crush that in January 2022. The growing social conflict, political conflict in Myanmar, Burma, which is a close Beijing ally, that's just in a total mess. And there's lots of other crises that are happening across the region, which is making the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, a little bit more tenuous than it seemed perhaps a decade ago. The corruption drive within China is not really seeing the successes that Xi Jinping perhaps wanted with the mass protests across social classes against the zero COVID policy, the demographic crisis that last year, since 1961, the Chinese population sees a contraction and not a growth, indicating to the social economic anxieties of the Chinese people going forward, not at all in line with how Xi Jinping wants to promote the Chinese internal situation as one in which the people are confident going forward in terms of housing and employment, etc. That's not the case at all. And then in relation to Taiwan, the breakaway republic from which the Chinese consider their own, that the US is going to perhaps, and is starting to use very much like it used Ukraine. The West has ensnared Russia and secondarily China in its Ukraine trap, and now wants to ensnare China totally in the Taiwan trap. And so it seems that the Chinese leadership are not sure what to do around that. Now, a more functional approach would be a revolutionary Chinese leadership that understands that the only way to deal with the West's development of war against it is to be brave, to confront the West strategically, not in a foolish manner, and in line with what Mao said, imperialism is a paper tiger. It seems scary and intimidating, but actually when you stand up to it, it backs off. We haven't had that now for quite a while, and the Russian and Chinese leadership have blundered here and there around that, and also much of the global South capacity has been destroyed in the last 10-15 years, not least because of the Arab Spring or the Arab Sting in circa 2011. So to sum up, it's clear we're going to see more noise from Western media justifying its war approach with China in instrumentalizing and weaponizing the breakaway republic and island of Taiwan in that regards. In terms of the interests of world peace and the oppressed of the world, growing war has to be avoided at all costs. There should be peace, a just peace in Ukraine. There should be a move towards reparations in terms of the NATO destruction of Libya, for example. Then the world laboring and oppressed people do not want to see growing tensions in relation to the West and its war approach to China. So that has to be the advocacy in the interests not only of the world's oppressed, but also of the environment as well, which is being destroyed and people are suffering around that. However, in all of these strategies, people have very little leadership or are leaderless, so it's really incumbent on people themselves to raise their voices, to be independent-minded, but loyal to a just peace which sees a way out of the contradictions and the oppressions that capitalist colonialism and the Western neo-colonial order, and also the dysfunctionalities of the narrow nationalism of the Russians and the Chinese and other are playing into. That's Counter-Narrative News, bringing you Week in Review. Hope that's of some interest. Please continue to encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's the only radical leftist anti colonial, pro-oppressed daily news analysis channel we have out there. Thank you.